Ellie Costello tears into Wes Streeting on live interview and accuses Labour of being scared of elections. Imagine a government so terrified of facing voters that they've decided to just cancel elections for 4 million people, leaving some councillors in office for 7 years without ever having to justify their record to the electorate. Sounds like something from a dodgy authoritarian regime, right? Well, welcome to Britain in 2025, where Keir Starmer's Labour government is invoking obscure legal powers to postpone at least 27 council elections. And when challenged about it, they're claiming it's all just sensible administrative housekeeping. GB News host Ellie Costello wasn't buying it for a second, absolutely tearing into Health Secretary Wes Streeting on air, branding the move a disgraceful attack on democracy, and asking point-blank if Labour's running scared of the electorate. Streeting's response was a masterclass in political deflection, insisting this isn't party political while somehow ignoring that 3/4 of the councils delaying elections are Labour-run. So let's break down this beautiful car crash of an interview, explore whether there's any legitimate justification for cancelling elections, and figure out why even Labour's own defenders are struggling to make this look like anything other than cowardice dressed up as efficiency. Ellie Costello came out absolutely swinging, and you've got to respect the directness. No gentle warm-up questions, no letting the minister settle into comfortable talking points. Straight in with the accusation that 4 million people are being denied the right to vote, in which she called a disgraceful attack on democracy. That framing immediately put Streeting on the defensive, because how do you respond to being accused of attacking democracy? You can't just shrug and say, yeah, we're cool with that. You have to mount some kind of defense, which means the entire interview is fought on terrain that's hostile to the government's position. It's brilliant journalism because it forces accountability rather than just giving politicians a platform for unchallenged spin. The question, are you running scared of the electorate, is perfect because it's impossible to answer without looking bad. If you say yes, you're admitting weakness and cowardice. If you say no, you have to explain why you're canceling elections, and any explanation immediately sounds like excuse-making. Streeting went for option 2, insisting Labour's not afraid of voters, and launching into his prepared defense about local government reorganization. But the denial rings hollow when the facts are so obvious. Labour's polling is absolutely abysmal. Local elections in May would be a bloodbath, so they're canceling them. The causal relationship is pretty clear, regardless of whatever administrative justifications they trot out. Streeting's response is interesting because it tries to walk this impossible tightrope between acknowledging that voting is fundamental while justifying why it's being suspended. He says the right to vote is fundamental and any delays should be a last resort that needs justifying to the electorate, which sounds reasonable until you remember that's exactly what's happening. Delays are being imposed and the justifications are transparently weak. Saying we don't want to set precedents for abuse of democracy in the future while literally abusing democracy in the present is genuinely Orwellian. It's like saying we must protect free speech by banning criticism of the government. The argument that some councils are being abolished so it doesn't make sense to elect people to bodies that won't exist is the government's strongest defense, but it still doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Yes, local government is being reorganized in some areas. District councils are being replaced by unitary authorities, new mayoral systems are being introduced. That's all true, but councils get reorganized all the time without democracy being suspended. You hold elections, the newly elected councillors serve during the transition period, and then when the new structure comes into force, you hold elections again under the new system. Is it slightly inefficient? Sure. Does it cost money? Yep, but democracy isn't supposed to be convenient or cheap. It's supposed to be fundamental and non-negotiable. The claim that councils choosing to delay elections come from a range of political parties and this isn't party political is technically true but deeply misleading. Yes, councils run by different parties are involved, but 3/4 of the councils delaying elections are Labour-run. That's not a random distribution, that's a clear pattern. If this was genuinely about administrative necessity rather than political calculation, you'd expect the party breakdown to roughly match the overall distribution of council control. Instead, it's overwhelmingly Labour councils taking advantage of this power, which strongly suggests political motivation regardless of what Streeting claims. The context of Labour's polling collapse makes the timing absolutely devastating for the government's credibility. They won a landslide less than a year ago, and their support has cratered. Every poll shows them hemorrhaging voters. Local elections would be the first real electoral test of their government, and all signs point to a massacre. So suddenly, conveniently, those elections aren't happening in dozens of Labour-controlled areas. You can insist that's coincidence, that it's all about local government reorganization, but nobody's buying it. The optics are absolutely terrible, even if the technical justification has some merit. Nigel Farage launching a judicial review is politically smart because it keeps the story alive and positions reform as defenders of democracy against Labour authoritarianism. Whether the legal challenge succeeds is almost beside the point. The process itself generates headlines, forces the government to defend their position repeatedly, and creates the narrative that Labour's so scared of voters they'll cancel democracy rather than face judgment. That's damaging messaging that will stick regardless of the legal outcome. The invocation of the Local Government Act of 2000 is fascinating because it's such an obscure power that most people had no idea it existed. It was meant for genuine emergencies, exceptional circumstances that made holding elections impossible or deeply problematic. Natural disasters, major constitutional crises, that sort of thing. It was not designed as a get-out-of-jail-free card for governments facing bad polling. But once you've got the power on the books, it's very hard to prevent governments from creatively reinterpreting what counts as exceptional circumstances. This is why civil liberties advocates are always warning about emergency powers, because once granted, they get used far more broadly than originally intended. The Electoral Commission suggesting these circumstances don't meet the threshold for exceptional is hugely significant because they're the independent experts whose literal job is overseeing elections. When they're saying this doesn't justify postponement, that should be dispositive. The government should listen to the independent watchdog and proceed with elections. But governments rarely let independent expertise override political calculation, which is exactly what's happening here. The Commission's judgment is being ignored because it's inconvenient. The fact that some councils will skip elections for the second year running, meaning councillors could serve 7-year terms, is where this crosses from questionable to genuinely outrageous. 5-year parliamentary terms are considered long enough that fixed-term parliament acts were controversial. 7 years without facing voters isn't democracy, it's oligarchy. Representatives derive legitimacy from regular accountability. When that accountability vanishes, so does legitimacy. You're no longer serving at the pleasure of your constituents, you're just occupying a seat until someone eventually decides you should face judgment. James Cleverly's response hits all the right notes politically because he gets to position conservatives as defenders of democracy against Labour overreach, which is quite the role reversal from some of their own democratic questionabilities over the years. But his substantive point is correct. Residents do have a right to choose who represents them. That right shouldn't be suspended because it's administratively convenient or politically advantageous for the incumbent party. The accusation that Labour's performed yet another U-turn is also effective because it ties into the broader narrative of a government that says one thing and does another. What's particularly damaging is that Labour presumably made commitments about these elections proceeding when they were in opposition or early in government. Politicians from all parties probably assured constituents they'd have their say in May. Now, those promises are being broken, and the excuse is local government reorganization that was entirely foreseeable. It's not like these restructuring plans emerged overnight. The government knew this was coming and could have planned around it without canceling elections. The fact that they didn't suggests either incompetence in planning or deliberate strategy to create justification for postponement. The cost argument that Streeting deployed is particularly cynical because it frames democracy as an expense we can't afford rather than a fundamental right worth protecting regardless of cost. Yes, elections cost money. Staff need to be paid, polling stations need to be set up, ballots need to be printed and counted, but that's the cost of democracy. It's not optional expenditure you cut when budgets are tight. Imagine if the government said, we're canceling the general election because it's too expensive and we're restructuring how parliament works anyway. People would rightfully lose their minds. Local democracy deserves the same protection as national democracy. The argument that councils choosing to delay elections come from a range of political parties, and this isn't party political, is technically true, but functionally misleading, which is the worst kind of political spin. It's not technically a lie, but it creates a false impression. Yes, some non-labor councils are involved, but the overwhelming majority are labor-run. That's not a random distribution, that's a clear pattern. If this was genuinely about administrative necessity rather than political calculation, you'd expect the party breakdown to roughly match the overall distribution of council control. Instead, it's overwhelmingly labor councils taking advantage of this power, which strongly suggests political motivation regardless of what Streeting claims. The broader pattern of labor's governance continues to be doing whatever's convenient in the moment and hoping people don't notice or care. Winter fuel payments, farmers' inheritance tax, digital IDs, jury trials, Chinese embassy, now canceling elections. Every time they face a difficult decision, they seem to choose the option that's easiest politically in the short term while creating massive credibility problems long term. That's not governing with principle, that's crisis management as default mode. If you've powered through this breakdown of labor's democracy-canceling adventure and Ellie Costello's beautiful takedown of Wes Streeting, you're exactly the engaged